Chilling tales for dark nights.
It must be awful for some whose memories of childhood bring only fear and sadness. Those who look back upon lone hours in vast and dismal chambers with brown hangings and mouldering old rows of antique books, or peering out at nothing but twilight groves of grotesque, gigantic vine-encumbered trees. Well, that was me. Yes, the dazed, the disappointed, the barren, the broken, and yet, strange as it sounds, I'm content, and I cling desperately to those gloomy memories when my mind momentarily threatens to reach beyond to those other memories. Where was I born? I'm not sure. The castle was infinitely old and infinitely horrible, full of dark passages and high ceilings where the eye could find only cobwebs and shadows. The stones in the crumbling corridors seemed always hideously damp, and there was an appalling smell everywhere as of the piled-up corpses of dead generations. It was never light, so that sometimes I used to light candles and gaze steadily at them for relief, nor was there any sun outdoors, since the terrible trees grew high above the topmost accessible tower. There was one black tower which reached above the trees into the unknown outer sky, but was partly ruined and couldn't be ascended except by a well-nigh impossible climb up that sheer wall, stone by stone. I must have lived years in this place, but I can't measure the time. Someone must have cared for my needs, yet I can't recall any person except myself, or anything at least alive, but the noiseless rats and bats and spiders. Whoever nursed me must have been astonishingly old, since my first conception of a living person was someone like myself, yet distorted, shriveled, and decaying, like the castle. Now, to me there was nothing grotesque in the bones and skeletons in some of the stone crypts deep down among the foundations. I fantastically associated these things with everyday events and thought them more natural than the colored pictures of living beings which I found in many of the moldy books. From these books I learned all that I know. No teacher urged or guided me, and I don't recall hearing any human voice in all those years, not even my own, but although I had read of speech, I had never thought to try to speak aloud. My appearance was a matter equally unthought of, since there were no mirrors in the castle, and I merely regarded myself by instinct, perhaps similar to the youthful figures I saw drawn and painted in those books. I felt conscious of youth because I remembered so little. Outside, across the putrid moat and under those dark trees, I would often lie and dream for hours about what I read in those books, and would longingly picture myself among gay crowds in the sunny world beyond that endless forest. Once I tried to escape from the forest, but as I went farther from the castle, the gloom grew denser and the air more filled with brooding fear, until I ran frantically back, lest I lose my way in a labyrinth of nighted silence. So, through endless twilights, I dreamed and waited, though I don't know what I waited for. Then, in the shadowy solitude, my longing for light grew so frantic that I could rest no more, and I began fixating on that single black, ruined tower that reached above the forest into that unknown outer sky. And at last I resolved to scale that tower, fall though I might, but better to glimpse the sky and perish than to live without every day. In the dank twilight I climbed the worn and aged stone stairs till I reached the level where they ceased, and thereafter clung perilously to small footholds leading upward. Grim and terrible was that dead, stairless cylinder of rock, black, ruined, deserted, and sinister. But more distressing and terrible still was the slowness of my progress. Even though I kept climbing, the darkness overhead grew no thinner, and a new chill, like a haunted and primordial mole, encircled me. I shivered as I wondered why I couldn't reach the light, and I would have looked down had I dared, and groped in vain with one free hand for a window ledge so I could peer out and above and try to judge my height. All at once, after an infinity of overwhelming, sightless crawling up that concave and desperate precipice, I felt my head touch something solid, and I knew I must have reached the roof, or at least maybe some kind of floor. In the darkness, I raised my free hand and tested the barrier, finding it stone, immovable. Then another deadly circuit of the tower, clinging to whatever holds the slimy walls could give, till finally my testing hand felt the obstruction yielding, and I turned upward again, pushing the slab or the door with my head, as I was using both hands in my fearful ascent. There was no light revealed above, and as my hands went higher, I knew that my climb was for the time being ended, since the slab was the trap door of an opening leading to a level stone surface, somewhat like a floor, no doubt the floor of some lofty and sizable observation chamber. I crawled through carefully and tried to prevent the heavy slab from falling back into place, but failed in that attempt. But I hoped when necessary I could pry it open again. Believing I was now at a remarkable height, far above the hateful branches of the forest, I dragged myself up from the floor and fumbled about for windows so that I could look for the first time at the sky and the moon and stars, all that I had read about. But on every hand I was disappointed, since all that I found were these vast shelves of marble bearing odious oblong boxes of disturbing size, and I wondered what ancient secrets might abide in this room so many centuries cut off from the castle below. Then, unexpectedly, my hands came upon a sort of doorway made of stone. It was rough, with strange chiseling. Trying it, I found it locked, but with a supreme burst of strength I overcame all obstacles and dragged it open inward. And as I did, there came to me the purest ecstasy I've ever known. There, shining tranquilly through an ornate grating of iron and down a short stone passageway of steps that ascended from the newly found doorway, was the radiant full moon, which I had never before seen except in dreams and in vague visions. Visions I didn't dare call memories. Believing now that I had attained the very pinnacle of the castle, I began to push up the few steps beyond the door. But the sudden clouding over of the moon caused me to stumble, so I felt my way more slowly in the dark. It was still very dark when I reached the grating, which I tried carefully and found unlocked, but I didn't open it for fear of falling. Then the moon came out again, and nothing I had before undergone could compare in terror with what I now saw. The sight itself was as simple as it was stupefying. Instead of seeing the tops of trees, as I would have expected, there stretched around me, at eye level, through the grating, nothing less than solid ground, on which were marble slabs and columns, and overshadowed by an ancient stone church whose ruined spire gleamed ghost-like in the moonlight. Half unconscious, I opened the grating and staggered out onto the white gravel path that stretched away in two directions. My mind, stunned and chaotic as it was, still held the frantic craving for light, and not even the fantastic wonder which had happened could stay my course. I neither knew nor cared whether my experience was insanity, dreaming, or magic. I was determined to gaze on brilliance and gaiety at any cost. I didn't know who I was, or what my surroundings might be, though as I continued to stumble along, I became conscious of a kind of fearsome, latent memory that made me sense this was all not just simply by chance. I passed under an arch, and leaving the slabs and columns, I wandered through the open country, sometimes following the visible road, but sometimes leaving it curiously to tread across meadows, where only occasional ruins bespoke the ancient presence of a forgotten road. Once I swam across a swift river where crumbling, mossy masonry told of a bridge long vanished. Over 2 hours must have passed before I reached what seemed to be my goal, an ivy-covered castle in a thickly wooded park, maddeningly familiar, yet also full of perplexing strangeness to me. I saw that the moat was filled in and that some of the well-known towers were demolished, while new wings existed to perhaps confuse the viewer. But what I observed with chief interest and delight were the open windows, gorgeously ablaze with light and the sound of festive revelry. Advancing to one of these, I looked in and saw an oddly dressed company indeed, making merry and speaking cheerfully to one another. I had never seemingly heard human speech before, and I could guess only vaguely what was said. Some of the faces seemed to hold expressions that again brought up incredibly remote recollections. Others were utterly alien. And then, as I stepped through the low window into the brilliantly lighted room, I did so from my single bright moment of hope to my blackest convulsion of despair and realization. The nightmare was quick to come. Scarcely had I crossed the sill when suddenly there arose a sudden and unheralded fear of hideous intensity. They began running, everyone, and in the clamor and panic several fell in faint and were dragged away by their madly fleeing companions. Many covered their eyes with their hands and plunged blindly and awkwardly in their race to escape, overturning furniture and stumbling against the walls before they managed to reach one of the many doors. And as I stood in the brilliant apartment, now alone and dazed, listening to their vanishing echoes, now I too feared and trembled at the thought of what might be lurking near me, unseen. The room seemed deserted, but when I moved toward one of the alcoves, I thought I detected a presence there, a hint of motion beyond the doorway leading to another room, and as I approached, I began to recognize the presence more clearly. And then, there, before me, in full, frightful vividness, the inconceivable, indescribable, and unmentionable monstrosity which had by its simple appearance changed a merry company to a herd of delirious fugitives. I can't even hint what it was like. It was a compound of all that is unclean, uncanny, unwelcome, abnormal, and detestable. It was the ghoulish shade of decay, antiquity, and desolation, the putrid, dripping thing of unwholesome revelation, something the merciful earth should always hide. Oh, God knows it was not of this world, or no longer of this world. Yet to my horror I saw in its eaten-away and bone-revealing outlines, with moldy, disintegrating clothing clinging to it, a leering, horrent travesty on the human shape. I was almost paralyzed, but as I attempted to move backward, I stumbled and nearly fell. I tried to raise my hand to shut out the sight, yet so stunned were my nerves that my arm could not fully obey my will, and the attempt was enough to disturb my balance, and now I had to stagger forward several steps to avoid falling, and as I did so, I became suddenly and agonizingly aware of the nearness of the fleshy thing, whose hideous, hollow breathing I half fancied I could hear. Nearly mad, I found myself yet able to throw out a hand to ward off the fetid apparition which pressed so close, when in one cataclysmic second of cosmic nightmarishness and hellish accident, my fingers touched the rotting, outstretched paw of the monster before me. And in that same second, there crashed down upon my mind a single and fleeting avalanche of soul-annihilating memory. I knew, in that second, all that had been. I remembered beyond the frightful castle and the trees, and recognized the altered mansion in which I now stood, and I recognized, most terrible of all, the unholy abomination that stood leering before me. But in the cosmos, there is consolation as well as bitterness. In the supreme horror of that second, I forgot what had horrified me. and the burst of black memory vanished in a chaos of echoing images. As if dreaming, I fled from that haunted and accursed pile, and I ran swiftly and silently in the moonlight. When I returned to the churchyard place of marble and went down the steps, I found the stone trapdoor immovable, but I wasn't sorry. I had hated the antique castle and the trees. Now I ride with the mocking and benign ghouls on the night wind, and play by day amongst the catacombs. And I know that light is not for me, save that of the moon over the rock tombs and pillars, nor any gaiety. Yet in my new wildness and freedom, I almost welcome the bitterness of alienage. And yes, I know always that I am an outsider, a stranger in this century, and among those who are still men. I've known it ever since I stretched out my fingers to that abomination, stretched out my fingers and touched a cold and unyielding surface of polished glass.
Chilling tales for dark nights.